You're listening to Where We Are, a weekend conversation on faith, politics, family, and culture, hosted by me, Michael Ware, and my wife, Melissa. We bring our wide-ranging experiences in politics, ministry, and nonprofit life to bear as we discuss the issues of the day. On this week's episode, we're going to talk social media, smartphones, family, all stemming from John Haidt's recent article for The Atlantic. This is Where We Are. This is Where We Are. We are the Wares. I'm Michael.
I'm Melissa.
Melissa, let's get right to it. We both spent some time with this article in The Atlantic from John Haidt. John wrote in The Atlantic an article with the headline, "End the Phone-Based Childhood Now." In this article, he recounts what has now become a pretty, now it's like standard argument. Mm-hmm. Jean Twenge is probably one of the main folks associated with making this kind of argument that I'll read from the beginning of the article. Something went suddenly and horribly wrong for adolescents in the early 2010s. By now, you've likely seen the statistics. Rates of depression and anxiety in the U.S. rose by more than 50% in many studies from 2010 to 2019. The suicide rate rose 48% for adolescents ages 10 to 19. For girls ages 10 to 14, it rose 131%. Haidt goes on to catalog rise of loneliness, friendlessness, decline of reading and math scores, young adults dating less, showing less interest in ever having children, more likely to live with their parents, less likely to get jobs as teens, managers saying they're harder to work with. I mean, just this catalog of issues. And, Haidt, along with others, attribute this in large part, not entirely, but in large part, to the transition from flip phones to mass adoption of smartphones in the early 2010s. Haidt continues, goes on to make an argument that we have a phone-based childhood that took shape roughly 12 years ago, and this is quoting Haidt now, it's making young people sick and blocking their progress to flourishing in adulthood. We need a dramatic cultural correction, and we need it now. We'll get into, basically, Haidt recommends the development or recovery of 4 norms. But Melissa, let's just stop there and sort of, do you buy the argument? What does it? What does sort of the way Haidt sets up the problem? What does it sort of bring to mind for you?
I do buy the argument, and I will admit one of the reasons why I buy the argument just right off the bat is that we don't have many other good explanations to explain the exponential rise in all of these problems in the 2010s when it comes to measuring all these things. One of the things that's not mentioned right there in the beginning is suicide rates as well, how they have skyrocketed. And so I know that that's not a complete reason as to why you buy into something, but I think that means that we should be always searching for the multiple reasons why some of these things have, sort of come together to create this sort of mess. But I do believe the argument that smartphone access and social media are the 2 most major culprits that we have. And I think what Haidt is doing here is that we've been hearing about this for a while, like, oh, it's the phones. I think and again, like you mentioned, Gene Twenge and like others, like what they're doing is that they're now starting to be able to connect it with brain development, so childhood development. So, taking that kind of expertise and putting it on this stuff, and our neural pathways are being basically interrupted by this technology, and so our brains aren't able to develop as they used to, and we are discovering that what we used to do, which was like play, being outside, social interaction, that those are most likely the fundamental
the things of yesteryear. Yes.
But what this is all proving as well is that these might actually be the most fundamental things that we need for our brain development. Like we're now, one way or the other, we're getting proof that those things actually work, because replacing those things with the smartphones and with the tablets, whatever the sort of electronic devices that delivers, the social media and the YouTube videos and the TikTok videos, whatever, we're getting some pretty good proof here that those other sort of fundamental things that a lot of generations before us have grown up with are actually fundamental. Like, we don't just call them fundamental because we're nostalgic about the past, or like, this is the way that I grew up, but those things might actually work.
Yeah.
So I do find he puts in this article at one point, which I find compelling, especially on the anxiety rates, that our brains get so used to, and by our brains, I mean children's brains get so used to the dopamine high of accessing that tablet, every single day, playing the games or watching the Bluey videos, whatever. And so then when they don't have that, the dopamine high goes away. And so then they're always seeking it out. And that's why it starts to become an addiction. So, there's that explanation. But when the brain doesn't get those dopamine highs at the level that the electronic device access is actually forcing the brain to sort of like set a new carrying capacity or set a new threshold, when it doesn't get it, the things that result are like irritability, and anxiety is one of them. They discovered that anxiety rates go up because the brain is basically freaking out that it can't get back up to the high that it's now used to. And to me, I'm like, oh, that would explain our anxiety rates right there. It's not just like the content of what's going on, because that has been sort of where my focus has been ever since I've been reading up on this particular issue of like, oh, it's the phones. I've been thinking about, okay, it's the content, especially for like girls and puberty, and how the numbers have been so high for depression. But I see explanations like that and I go, oh, it's just simply the access. It doesn't really matter the content in a lot of ways. And to me, that's a pretty fundamental argument that I find to be pretty compelling. There was one other paragraph in this article that I also found to be really interesting and compelling, but Michael, I'll stop there and let you jump in.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, so he has this paragraph and he begins, end quote, "When our public life becomes fragmented, ephemeral, and incomprehensible, it is a recipe for anomie or normlessness. The great French sociologist Emile Durkheim showed long ago that a society that fails to bind its people together with some shared sense of sacredness and common respect for rules and norms is not a society of great individual freedom. It is rather a place where disoriented individuals have difficulty setting goals and exerting themselves to achieve them." Durkheim argued that anomie was a major driver of suicide rates in European countries. Modern scholars continue to draw on his work to understand suicide rates today, end quote. I found that paragraph to be quite interesting, just to be talking about like a lot, not just like the smartphone access and social media, that a lot of like the sort of things that ail us or what we feel like ails us, I think could be sort of encapsulated in this, what he writes about, like this lack of sacredness, this lack of common respect for rules, this lack of norms and what it does to societies. I thought was a really great argument to be sticking in here as well, because I think for anybody who's skeptical still can look at our politics, can look at the division and say, okay, a lot of this stuff seems to actually be quite related. And fun fact, I do believe it is.
Yeah, no, I thought that was interesting too. I will say what I wasn't as familiar with. And, I will say I wasn't familiar with this question being asked at all. So maybe, there are counter examples. I found it really interesting the point he goes into right after that paragraph you just read, which is that young people aren't exactly thrilled with social media and their lives. So, like their lives as it, as it involves smartphones, social media. A majority of students were asked, when asked, would you prefer to live in a world without Instagram or TikTok? A majority said yes. I found that to be pretty interesting. And then I had heard about this study before, a study from a economist out of the University of Chicago. They recruited more than 1,000 college students and asked them how much they'd need to be paid to deactivate their accounts on Instagram or TikTok for 4 weeks. And on average, students said they need to be paid about $50. Then the experimenters told the students that they were going to try to get most of the others in their school to deactivate from that same platform. And then asked how much would you have to be paid to deactivate if most others did so. The answer, on average, was less than zero. In each case, most students were willing to pay in order to be freed from these apps. Super interesting. Haidt describes it accurately. Then he says sort of smartphones, social media presents a collective action problem that people can't get out because others are sort of participating. But if others weren't participating, they would love to get out. I thought that was a really interesting aspect of the evidence he put together here.
Yeah, it made me think of specifically on that whole section on collective action. It's interesting because it not even in that section of this article, but he talks about us millennials and talks about our childhoods as a good sort of like counterpoint of like, okay, millennials had a bit of access to the internet, that kind of thing. Now, why aren't they as messed up? Which I found to be funny. And he talks about how childhood began changing in the 70s and 80s and how the sort of advent of the overprotective parent came about, especially because a lot of parents were being told that, kids were being kidnapped every 5 seconds. And so people started going inside and, a bunch of other things. But overprotectiveness became an issue. And I just found it to be extremely interesting that he doesn't quite name it himself, but I found the juxtaposition to sort of be poetic in that, I mean, you and I, Michael, we talk all the time about overprotectiveness, and are you and I ever being overprotective? We really don't want to be that way. Do we notice it in other parents around us? And I still think overprotectiveness is actually still quite evident in a lot of our peer parents. And this is not a judgment or anything. I'm trying to say this value is neutral, but with technology, with social media access and the internet that's connected to it, and people who can be on social media, and what we all are now finding out about what using social media and using electronic devices does to our brains, I just find it so fascinating that there's this paradox of overprotectiveness in parenting, and yet so many of us parents have chosen to just let our kids have access to all these things. And he goes back to a much older argument of like an early 2010s argument. I remember hearing this quite a bit. And we were, very early 20s and late teens when I started hearing these arguments of like, oh, I'm allowing my kid to have this because, it's a digital age. They need to grow up with this. They're going to get a leg up, getting a job.
They're
going to
be digital natives.
They're going to be digital natives.
All this stuff is
very much an economic argument.
Yes.
All an economic and capitalist argument, all of them. And so I just find it so fascinating that there's this overprotectiveness, and yet I'm going to mention an example here, and again, no judgment on this person, but there was a TikTok that went viral about a couple months ago, and I brought it to you, Michael, and I said, look at what's going on here. And it was this mother who said that her 7-year-old was on Roblox, which is a game-based type app that a lot of young children are on. And she said, I was noticing some really weird behavior from my child, withdrawn, and so on and so forth for a few months. And finally, I went on her Roblox account, and I discovered that there was essentially what was almost definitely an adult talking to my daughter and just saying really awful, nasty things to her over a period of months. And I went and I came to you, Michael, and I said, and this person, and again, she was being very vulnerable, and honestly, she was probably helping a lot of other parents by putting out this video, said, I really hadn't checked into what Roblox was and what kind of platform it was and what kind of access my child would have to basically, the sort of user journey. And I said to Michael, and I said, how is it that hopefully we would never let our 7-year-old, well, we have a 5-year-old. We would never let our 5-year-old, we would just never drop her off in the middle of New York City and say, hey, go have at it by yourself. Why do we do this with online forums, with technology? Why do we sort of drop off our kids in the middle of the so-called tech city and just let them go wild? But these are just fun. For whatever reason, there's a lot of trust sort of put into these things,
right?
Into technology companies and what's been built, and if it's being marketed towards kids, therefore it's safe for my kid. And so I come into this saying,
why would a games app allow for messaging for 5-year-old children, 7-year-old children?
And so one of the things, because Haidt puts at the end of his article, so sort of 4 norms that should start happening, which no smartphones before high school, no social media before 16, phone-free schools.
Read these slowly.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Could you read those again?
So no smartphones before high school.
Norm 1.
Norm number 2, no social media before 16. Norm number 3, phone-free schools. And number 4, more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. I would say a 5th norm that I would add, and I guess that maybe this norm could be negated by the fact that if you don't allow your child to have it before 16 and before high school, which is essentially a similar age, parents, you need to go through every single platform, no matter what age your child is, and vet it heavily. I would say that that's also another norm. Even if your child is 16 years old, I would, if you do that, you go on Snapchat, you see what actually happens. You go on Roblox, you see what actually happens. You go on Minecraft, you see what actually happens. You need to vet these things. You pretend as if you're putting them into the middle of a city by themselves. Is basically a norm that I would say.
I mean, though, right, somewhat ironically, then, Haidt's advice is kind of not quite let your kids go in the middle of a city by themselves, but it is this sort of they need to be free to explore, run errands on their own. He raises specifically the idea of a 9-year-old, 9-year-old child going to the corner, the corner store to grab something. And so it is interesting. And the way that he frames it is, if we're going to be taking away ready access to these apps, smartphones, it needs to be replaced with something. But I'm not quite sure what the psychology, I think that's a really potent problem, which is he's calling for more vigilance on against smartphones, access to social media apps, etc., but calling for like a loosening grip
Yes.
on
Basically,
other areas of life. Again, free exploration, unsupervised play is sort of the term that's used. And I don't know what the I mean, he's the psychologist, the social psychologist. I'm not sure what kind of psychological environment is necessary to produce both of those things, sort of a loosening up. Because I do think, I think so many parents are the the dangers of smartphone usage, the dangers of these apps, even with the evidence he lays out, it's not as rational a thought process than I'm glad my teenager isn't drinking at someone else's house outside of my supervision. So I think part of this, and Haidt does talk about it a bit, but I do think so much of giving kids access to smartphones, all this is, it's almost like a lesser of evils kind of thing. Just like, look, I'm not sure this is the best thing for them, but they seem safer in their bedroom on their phone for 4 hours at night than out, as my mother would say, out gallivanting. Gosh, I got a flashback using the word gallivanting.
I remember hearing her say that.
Yes.
So here's what I would say to that. I think that this isn't definitely an open discussion. Haidt talks about at one point embodiment. So the physicality of growing up, of learning norms and rules and ways of being in the world. And here it seems like he is valuing more physical embodiment versus what the tech and smartphones and social media can provide for that kind of development. That it's basically nothing. And so but yes, the logic, the line of logic there for parents of, I'd rather my kid be sitting in their bedroom than out partying, out getting drunk, out getting exposed to whatever, is there. But Haidt, with this whole article and with Jean Twenge and all of these psychologists coming out trying to push these arguments of you think all this stuff is safe on the surface, but that's because you don't know what's on these apps in the first place, in the case of the Roblox mom, or you don't know what's actually happening to your child's brain when they have access to this all the time. No, I just bring all this up of the sort of open discussion, but I mean also part of the norm making, or the social norm making here that Haidt, that has to be worked on, is that parents have to understand the harms that all of this does. But then here's one of the other problems here that comes up, that when it comes to the differences between our millennial childhoods versus Gen Z childhoods, or Gen X childhoods versus Gen Z childhoods, is that there are a lot of economic reasons behind why kids are being given access to smartphones, iPads, tablets, whatever it might be, at a much younger age, and that they're given the time and the chance to be on these things more. And I mean, what is in coordination with all of this? The rise of a second parent having to be, if there are two parents in the household, the second parent having to work in order to make ends meet. The fact that childcare is so wildly expensive in this country. Well, one of the ways to occupy your kid for a good hour so that you can get an hour's work done is to give them a tablet.
Yeah, sure.
It is basically a childcare aid. It is a distraction aid so that parents who are overwhelmed by every other thing going on in this planet can maybe have an hour's worth of peace, because their kid isn't, fighting, yelling, getting into something kind of thing. And so the sort of all the other societal problems that we have that are both economic and social, this tech access actually helps to solve. And it's one of the reasons, and he mentions in the article, like the rate of use of social media and or tablets, phones, that kind of thing, the rate of use in like poorer households is much higher. And you and I have talked about this quite a bit with schools and schools creating greater access to like Chromebooks and technology as well. We've discovered that there's now a reversal of a relationship between wealthy schools or poor district schools and access to technology. We've noticed that a lot of private, wealthier schools are now starting to...
Well, there was a New York Times article about this, which is sort of, it used to be, like early on, it was the signal of wealth and privilege for your school to have devices. And so that created philanthropic and political pressure to get devices, technology in all schools.
Yeah, for equity purposes.
For purposes of equity. But as this data started coming in about how awful this stuff can be, you saw elite schools, wealthy schools take devices out. And so you have a sort of a to your point, again, sort of a reverse situation here, that in the name of equity, sort of these technology was pushed, but now we find that what was pushed may be, I mean, literally, if in the sort of neurobiology of it, like a drug, and an addictive a drug with all kinds of negative impacts related to it.
Yeah. So one other thing that I would say, just on like the policy side of stuff for government, or we're seeing just this past week a TikTok ban has passed the House, and I reading up on it, what was in the bill, what would happen, all the details of it. One of the numbers that stood out to me was the amount of people in the United States that actually use TikTok. I knew it was pretty big because Facebook has been big for
170 million have accounts.
170 million have accounts, and almost 19% of the United States population accesses TikTok every single day. So our everyday users, almost 19% of the population. That's a wild amount.
Yes.
And with all of these things on like the policy side or sitting in government, you just have to sit back and ask, why is it that way? Why would so many people be on these platforms or using these things? What is going on? How could it, I think in this Height article it said teens are online around 5 hours a day, every single day. And that's a lot of hours when teens need to be getting sleep. They should be in school, actually attending classes. That should be taking a huge chunk of their day, et cetera, et cetera. Is just backing up to sort of like the politics side of this, is asking these fundamental questions of why is it this way? What in our society isn't able to fill the hole that clearly social media is able to play? And obviously Height's article gets into like the addictiveness, some of the things going on in society that were sort of already on their way up, but just, were made exponential because of tech and social media access. Like there's a bunch of, there's a lot of things going into this societally. And it's not just like, oh, it starts from the phones and then it goes out. It's just that the phones seem to be preying in a certain way on our psychology. But from the policy side of things, you just have to sit back and ask, why are teens on this for so long? What is sort of missing societally that cannot fill that hole? Because, Height, has all these new norms at the end, but you have to sort of say, where are teens or children supposed to go sometimes? If two parents are working, You come from a poor
right.
household. Like, what are they supposed to do? This is just filling a sort of a very convenient hole, a very lucrative hole that, all these tech companies have found over the past like 12 years since, smartphones became like the norm, the normal thing to buy when you go to AT&T or Verizon or whatever.
Right. Look, I think that this recommendation, I think all of the recommendations from Haidt are good ones. And I support them. I think if there was, I'll just be honest, I could see like it very much is a collective action problem, and I feel that in my own life. Like I just kind of feel like anticipating, like I could only hold out for so long, and only, but I think there were some of the things that he called for, the principle of the school sending out a letter just saying this is what we're pursuing as a community. If there were sort of the parents of our girls, friend groups, like, yes, and all of this conceptually makes sense. And I think is productive. His recommendation for more independence, free play, and responsibility in the world, he sort of addresses, that there's fear and sort of stigma involved. He says parents look at each other to determine what is normal and therefore safe. I think that covers part of it. I think what he doesn't get at as well is the judgment and the stigma and the just, he says if many parents started sending their children out to play or run errands, then the norms of what is safe and accepted would change quickly. Yeah, that's like one possibility.
Yeah.
The other possibility is like there are a whole bunch of like crazy stories about people calling the cops on parents and kids being taken away and child protective services being called. I think it is a little too optimistic that if I don't know what he means by many parents and what the scale of that is. I just think there are some really strong, like there are reasons why, and it's not just, send my kid to the playground and on their own and something will, like a kidnapper will take them. Though, like, there's also like how will people react to my daughter being at the playground alone? Mm-hmm. What will they take as their sort of prerogative if they see something going on that they don't agree with? That's the other level. So not like people who mean nefarious harm, but actually like people who think they're doing the right thing, people who think that they're being helpful. And so I think there's a huge impediment, and I'm not sure, like, changing the norms around that are going to be a little more difficult than just doing it, because there are like real and actual disincentive structures in place.
Yeah, no, I think that I think that there are a lot of structures that are in place that would go completely against all of this. I think our society, one of the reasons why tech was able to be so pervasive so fast in just a single decade is because our society is set up for somebody to be filling the holes, like I was mentioning before, and that like so many of our problems stem from other social problems that we have not solved yet. And so I think structurally, I think the collective action problem, just in terms of the whole don't allow your child to have a phone until 16, no social media accounts until high school. That's why Height focuses on these, because it's the lowest hanging fruit that would have at least some kind of impact, versus that this fourth one, the more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. I agree with you, is like the one that has a lot of obstacles in its way.
Yeah. And I just wonder, I'd love to hear more from, if you're a 13-year-old kid and all of your other friends, have their smartphones with them all the time, are, texting with their parents, are their parents are checking in on them on the find your iPhone,
Yep.
app. And, your parent has a no smartphone policy. Is the psychology, and of course it's different, and you could do different things to sort of send different messages, but I think we also know parents could try to be as intentional as possible about what message is being sent, and sometimes a different message is being received. Does the kid process that as, oh, my parent trusts me more than the other parents trust their kids, or I guess my parent is just less concerned about my well-being. I guess my parent is less sort of less attentive, or they have better things to do than to be checking on my. And so I just don't know in the current environment how some of these things play out. But I am convinced that there is a cost to not changing as well.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that the numbers that he has on, or the studies that he has, where they asked, these kids, would you, how much would you pay, or how much, would you need to receive in order to give up, your social media, that if Gen Z in particular, and probably most likely the generation that comes after them, recognizes that these platforms like Instagram and so on aren't good for them, that I think in general, again, because I don't have a 13-year-old, but would be
sometimes she thinks she is.
It's true, yeah. Sometimes she thinks she's 65. Is that the conversations that you also need to be having with your kids now that we have all this data and all this information on what the access to all of these different things does to the brain, that in whatever way is developmentally appropriate, that you have open conversations with your kids, so that hopefully you can avoid the child thinking, oh, my parent just doesn't care about me. It's, oh, my mom or my dad do trust me, and I don't, they don't check in on me this way because it would lead to other things. I think it's a lot of conversations will now need to be had as kids grow. And I think, Michael, because we have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, you and I will be having open conversations about why they don't have access to things like maybe some of their peers will. But one of my big hopes is that parents like us, some of the millennials, and then some coming up behind us, are seeing everybody else struggle with these things, and that hopefully our kids will be joined by other parents who do want to sort of follow the Height way of not allowing them to have a phone into a teenagehood, and so that kids will have other peers. But again, it's the collective action problem. Who knows if that will actually be reality.
Well, hey, again, we're the parents of 5 and a soon-to-be 3-year-old. Would love to hear stories from listeners, particularly parents, or even, younger listeners, teenagers, those who were recently teenagers, about sort of what good habits, what good norms you, your family, your parents instituted, And also maybe like some hard lessons that you learned, raising kids in this environment. We'd love to hear stories. You could reach out to us on social media over email to share those. We'd love to hear from you. But Melissa, I think that's all for this episode. Hope folks enjoyed and got something out of that conversation. Again, the Heights article is over at The Atlantic. The headline is "End the Phone-Based Childhood Now," and would obviously recommend you take a look. With that, that's where we are. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
It's the end of the weekend, but I still wanna turn up. Yeah, I still wanna turn up. All I want is to go again, but you ain't picking.